Hi, everyone. Welcome to Fireside Creators. I am Reverend Dr. Sherry Palace, and thank you for joining us this week. Today, we are having a starting off good already, a talk on theological activism. And I brought on Liam Hooper, who is going to explain it all to us and what exactly it is and how we can take part, and if we're already doing that. If you are on YouTube, please go ahead and like and subscribe. If you are in Facebook, register with StreamYard so I can see your name. Otherwise, you're just going to come through as a Facebook user. I also want to thank my sponsors. Ruth, Amanda, Michael, Kirsten, you guys are amazing. If you'd like to become a sponsor of the show, if you like what I'm doing each week, you can go to sherrypalace.com and there is a subscribe button where you can become a member for as little as $3 a month. It's just a cup of coffee to you, but it means everything to me. So I really appreciate your support. With no more words, because I want to focus on what this conversation is. I am really excited to find out exactly and learn from this. So like I said, I like to learn something in every show, and this is definitely going to be one where I learn things. So we have Liam Hooper. He is an M.Div, an author, gender theorist, theological activist, trans activist advocate, educator, podcaster, public speaker, and freelance content writer. Liam is a 2022 cohort fellow at the William C. Friday Fellowship for Human Relations and community participant in the Winston-Salem Portrait Project. When his work takes him to new and interesting places, his spouse Diana and their family terrier Dodie travel with them. Welcome, Liam. How are you?
I'm doing great, Sherry. How are you? It's great to be with you.
I am so happy that you could join us. No more ado. Tell me, let's just start right in. We've got some comments. Hold on. Let me see what people are saying, if I'm supposed to say hello to anyone. David's here. Yo, I see a Facebook user. Not sure who that is, but hi. Glad you're all here with us. Hi, Michelle. How are you? Thank you for joining. So, Liam, tell me what a theological activist is.
Well, so there's sort of a broad discussion about this in the last 10, 15 years. And so there's some variation of how people view it. So I'm going to give you the Liam Hooper spin on theological activism. So on one level, as a recently, over a long period of time, converted Jew, I would say that theological activism is just good Torah. Right. It's, finding a way to actually make a life way out of the beliefs that a person might claim they have around God and how God acts in the world and what our place is in the world and all those big, theological questions. What does it mean to be human? How are we supposed to conduct ourselves and comport ourselves in a universe where the presence of God is assumed? All that stuff, taking those big questions out of theory and moving them into daily practice, right? In some kind of lived life way that aims for social change.
So what kills me is the whole thoughts and prayers with no action.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So this is actually taking your belief system and creating a better world.
Yeah. And, so what's fascinating to me that a lot of people who do this kind of work, same kind of work I do, don't talk about is the truth is, who's really good at theological activism? Now, we might question how justice-oriented their activism is, but who's really good at it is fundamentalist evangelical Christians.
Really?
Yeah, they're freaking fabulous at it. Pardon me if I offended anybody. But if you stop and think about it, this makes sense.
Language is fine here.
I'll give you some examples of what I mean. About 30 or 40 years ago, for example, the radical right started doing a lot, members of Christendom, radical right, the empire of Christianity versus faith of Christianity, if that makes any sense,
yes.
Started doing a lot of written work and paradigmatic change based work, right? Like, so they started publishing books and articles and doing all this work around what words mean, like what is socialism, what is communism, what does human rights really mean, and all that. They started just shifting conversation until the point we're at now, where people don't actually know what socialism means. They don't actually know what a federalist republic is. Like, right? Like, people don't know what words mean. And when you can convince people words mean something different than what they've commonly been understood to mean, you can then shift conversation about religion. Right.
So the key point in how you said right before the evangelicals was we can argue about the justice or the applicability or the morality of it, but they're still doing it.
They're doing exactly the same thing that we have failed to do in response to it.
Interesting.
Right. Like, so I'm going to say something that may offend people, but hang with me. Liberalism is going to be the death of all of us if we don't get real honest about what it's come to mean in practice, right? Like,
expand on that.
Liberalism versus real progressivism, or real interrogative thought and interrogation of our systems, policies, procedures, constructs, institutions, right? Like, how our society actually functions. And until we're ready to do some really deep critical thinking about that and make systemic changes, we're just stuck in this world of ideas. And part of what's dangerous about that is we then evaluate everyone based solely on their ideas. And we decide people who don't have the elevated ideas we have are stupid, or they're idiots, or they're right. Like, we saw this with the Trump election. People are tired of being called idiots because they haven't read this or haven't read that, right? Like, people were tired of being made to feel less than because they had a differing opinion. And they had
isn't it a bit, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say they had a differing opinion in large part because of this 30 or 40 years of paradigmatic shifting.
Well, and isn't it a bit of do not become that of which ye hate?
Yes.
Because, I mean, the whole thing is supposed to be inclusivity. And if you go to one extreme or the other, you become an exclusivist. It's, it's our group here and we're better than you. And then if someone is always working off of ego and who is better, then there's always going to be a separation.
And there's always going to be a lesser, right? So what happens a lot of times when I'm teaching about this is people will say, I'll teach them the theology behind it and the practice behind it. And they'll say, well, what you're talking about, Liam, is basically the theology of the least of these. And I'll say, no, that's absolutely not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Right. Because first of all, that's problematic in the assumption there's always someone who's lesser. It assumes there's a least of, and that's okay. Right?
But isn't that who we're fighting for?
There are people who have been made less than versus people who simply somehow are less than. Right. Like, example, a capitalist discussion example, right? Okay. We've been taught in this country is built on a narrative that the poor will always be with you. And somehow there's something characterologically wrong with poor people.
Jesus is
like they're poor because they're lazy or they're shiftless or they're just not smart enough or they're not capable or right. And therefore they're part of the less than. And so we have soup kitchens and food pantries, but we don't look at the systems, institutionalized processes and policies and procedures that create poverty.
Yes.
Right. So what I'm talking about doing is believing in our faith enough, whatever it may be, whether we're Buddhist, whether we're Muslim, whether we're Jewish like me, and then one time, or Christian as I was at one time, whatever we are in our orientation to how we conceive of this force presence we call God, we must believe that that is true enough to put our feet to it and our hands to it and our shoulder to the plow, as the old saying is, right? It's not enough to talk about God and to worship in whatever way we worship for an hour or two a week and then feel pious.
I always say that love is a verb.
It is. It is absolutely a verb. And
if you make it a
actually,
noun, you begin to fail.
it
Because then
actually,
it goes back to a lack of inactivity, a lack of ambition, a lack of doing. I don't want thoughts. I don't want prayers. I want action.
yeah, you can keep your thoughts and prayers when people's lives are on the line, right? And
Yeah.
the truth is, if you look the word up in the dictionary, you find it is a verb.
Yeah.
It really is a verb. And what's beautiful for me, and sort of a double-edged sword, right? Like, it's one of these weird paradoxes we live in the empire of Christendom right now. The Hebrew word for love, ahava, right? It comes from a root av, which means to give or to serve, which is why the text actually says in the Hebrew, serve God with all your heart, right? It means do, which then tells you why, after the prophets told us for book after book after book, that God says, I'm not interested in your burnt offerings and your sin sacrifices. I'm interested in what you do. Well, then suddenly that little good Jewish boy from Nazareth comes along and he says nothing about what you believe.
No.
Not one thing, really. He says, do as I do. Come follow me. Do as I do. The Greek word actually means like, do what I do. And this is part of the thing that's been removed from our religious discourse, right? Christendom versus Christianity has done a very poor, and I would say by intent, job of religious education. People don't know how to go look up a word. What does it mean? They don't know the historical context, right? And all these things matter, because I can tell you have a question, but I want to say this so I don't forget it. The one thing that my brand of theological activism clings to is the idea of liberating sacred texts, whatever they may be, from the prison of doctrinal assumption, right? Separating scripture from doctrine, which is institutional and church-based or religion-based, right? Scriptures, and particularly the ones used in Judeo-Christian cultures, being the Hebrew text and the Greek, the Christian text, right? Those texts, and all of them, the Quran, Buddhist texts, Hindu texts, what these texts really are not the literal words of God, but the stories of human beings, the poetry, the songs, the prayers, the laments, the stories. And some of it is high literature, right? Well-crafted stories and poetry that tell us more about the human search for God and who God is, which then by extrapolation tells us something about how God might be experienced. And how God might be experienced begins to tell us something about this force presence we call God in human life, right? But the stories about the human search for God, which is then contributive to this larger, continuously being written story of humanity. And what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a human being in community with other human beings and to be relational by nature, right? And then what does it mean to comport ourselves with one another in a universe where the presence of God is assumed? That's what those stories are about. And that's why that the rabbis say, the sages say, the whole universe is in the Torah, right? We just have to keep turning it.
Yeah. I think a big problem is that we changed service to worship.
Yes.
Because if it's exclusively a worship thing, then again, we don't have to do anything. It's
Right.
I worship Jesus, as opposed to following him, because following him actually requires moving.
Yes.
And doing things. But if you just worship Jesus, then you can sit back and be like, okay, I'm fine. I've got everything down. And our world perpetuates into a pile of shit, which is what it is.
Yes, a big steaming pile of shit. And where you can track that is, historically speaking, when the church got in bed with Constantine, right? And we developed, and then became an empire into itself, right? And became Christendom. what happened was the cultivation is this very particular narrative. So I know that you and I have some similar schooling in common. So you learned, same as I did, for example, that the ending to the book of Mark, the first gospel plus Q that we believe the gospels are based on, right? The ending to Mark is an addendum. Earlier copies of that particular gospel don't contain that ending, which means the resurrection was invented later.
Yeah.
All right. So that's significant.
There's also some hidden scriptures about Jesus going off with a gay man for a few days.
Yeah.
That were in Mark too.
And the missing years. Where was Jesus in the missing? Yeah, the gospel, the Gnostic texts are just marvelous. But anyway, with this particular one, what coincides with that is the centuries long, just deeper and deeper cultivation of this narrative of personal salvation, which is actually Pauline.
Yeah.
And antithetical to what Jesus was doing. Jesus was a Jew.
Yeah.
Right? Paul was some kind of Jew,
a Hellenistic
had a different agenda, right?
Yeah, he was a Hellenistic Jew based on the Olympiad, not Judaism or the Abraham. So it was a melting pot of all of that. My guest on Saturday said that they just did a poll online and said, who do you or who created the most damage in the New Testament? Who do you have the most fervor for? And it was Paul. And I raised my hand and said, Paul.
Paul, yeah.
Paul, he did it all. He screwed it all up.
Yeah, but if you're Constantine and the emperors who come after Constantine, you really like what that narrative created, right? Because if I'm focused on my own personal savior, and if salvation no longer means deliverance from the narrows into the wide open liberated space, right? If it's no longer a social, socio-political, cultural, humane thing, and it's an individual, I don't want to go to hell, right?
Oh, wow.
If it becomes that, then I'm not going to worry about the conditions of this world.
Oh, that's so true.
Right?
That's so true.
And
I mean, Christendom is so hell focused, so afterlife focused, that this life is, that's what drives me the most crazy, is because we should be using religion to learn how to love each other, to learn how to be society, in a society, and to grapple with these things amongst each other, as opposed to separating us because you believe one thing and I believe another. If it's not giving us tools to better ourselves as human, and it goes to a focus of Santa Claus in the sky or whatever it is, then it takes all of the onus off of us.
Yes.
And we are the problem. It's not these types of things. We need to learn how to work together.
Yeah, and it's got layers too, right? That narrative. So if I'm one of the poor people in Appalachia, right? And there are reasons, socio-political, systemic reasons for that poverty, not my characterological flaw, right? Then that narrative tells me, as the old folks say here, until you're better paid, right? So you put your shoulder to the grindstone, you do what you have to do until your reward. So that makes me less likely to rise up, which is why slave masters taught enslaved people Christendom with parts of the Hebrew Bible removed. That's why slave Bibles had sections taken. The Exodus wasn't in there, right? So it was redacted on top of redactions. That serves one narrative. But then if I'm Carnegie and I'm sitting down developing what came to be known as the economic gospel, right? And I'm talking about how by nature, some people are just better with money and we should entrust them to it. And some people are just better at making money. And, they have a social obligation to toss out a soup kitchen or two.
The word blessed drives me crazy in this sense, because a couple years ago, I said, be blessed. And they said, why am I blessed and not someone in Africa? And that rocked my world, because I always thought that blessing, okay, well, I'm doing right. I'm doing all of these things. I'm blessed. But to take the prosperity gospel on top of that, and another way to exclude someone else, is if they're poor, then they're not walking right with Jesus. If they're poor, they're not blessed. And again, nothing to do with us and our system and all of that. It's taking all of the responsibility, all of the accountability off of us and just saying, okay, well, God wants them that way.
Right. And worse, prosperity gospel to me is one of the worst sins human beings have committed against one another since methadone, right? Like,
yeah.
It's because if I continue to suffer, then what that tells me is my faith is inadequate, or I'm just a piece of shit and even God doesn't love me, right? Like, and I grew up with that. As a person assigned female at birth, I grew up in a Baptist church in the South.
Oh,
and
wow.
So I spent, in addition to being messed with by psychiatrists and medicated and whatnot at a very early age, I spent my life praying to be different than I was because I believed somehow I had chosen to be this flawed, sinful, just, effed up individual that even God wouldn't love, right? And knowing at the same time, that's not right, right? Yeah. Like, that's not right. And one of the things I believe that this is one of the points I make in my book that I think makes the intersection of my personal story, which is layered, right? It's not just about gender. It's also about things like mental illness and trauma, right? And how we process that, and addiction and some degree of poverty, right? And I mean, lots of things. So the intersection of my story with theological activism is that I can say with conviction things like, I believe trans people are proof there's a soul. Because otherwise, right, how would we know who we are versus who you tell us, right? We know, the self knows who the self is. No matter how much you medicate it, no matter how much you program it. A Clockwork Orange is a perfect literary example of this, right? You can condition and brainwash a person all you want, but the self will rise. Always, right? And to me, that's the message of the resurrection. Not this literal physical body, but that you cannot kill the self, the God endowed self in every human being. And if we actually believed with our whole heart, body, soul, mind, and strength that that's true, that we are all endowed with identity, and that the body and the soul and the spirit are one, we would treat one another differently.
Most definitely. And David, I agree with you. Those are some powerful words.
Thank you, David.
It's that's a really interesting way to look at it, because I was just saying last week how trans people have the biggest struggle because every single one of us is trying to be authentic, and we're afraid to be, and we're trying to learn self-acceptance. And trans people are forced into that. We can deny it. We can go on about our day and never, ever, have to be the person that we are supposed to be. But in order for you to succeed and survive, you have to be authentic, and you have to be out there saying, this is me.
Yeah, someone said to me once, when I was sharing my story by way of teaching about gender and sex and sexuality, which I do, and I'm unlike a lot of theologians, right? The first part of my life, I was a therapist specializing in crisis stabilization, addiction, and co-occurring conditions, right? For obvious reasons. But someone said to me, you're so brave. I just so admire your courage. I said, don't admire my courage. It's not courage to refuse to die. Do you know what I mean? I'm not being brave. I'm doing that thing which I could no longer not do. Right? Right. I refused to lay down and die. Sometimes I used to think I was just too dumb to know when to lay down and quit, right? But I think it's that I just refused to believe what the world told me about myself. And so what I say to other people is, no matter how horrible you think you are on the inside, that you don't let us see, dare to believe it's not true.
Yeah. Be kind to
Dare
yourself.
to believe that you are the only you and you belong. You have a place, right? The wheel needs you to be your spoke.
So how do we become theological activists?
Well, I think we start there.
Okay.
Right? Like, so just one of the ways I say this is God is a mystery, right? These people who assume they know who God is and what God thinks and that God is apprehendable to the human comprehension are full of shit.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be God. If God could be captured and conceived in the human realm fully, it would cease to be something worthy of being deemed God, right?
That's my point.
Yes.
We've constructed God into a total asshole.
Right. And we have.
Mm-hmm.
One who believes, oh, you should all be millionaires, right? But anyway, except for you broad
I
people.
say who turns a blind eye to dying children, but
Yep.
opens up parking spaces and wins football games.
Yes. Don't we all just feel great about that, right?
Yeah.
But so just as there is no God but God, there is no you but you.
Mm. Like
so the way that we begin to live theological activism is by daring to be who it is in us to be. Now, I'm not saying go out and do harmful things, because then that's something else, right? That's about behavior.
Yeah.
Right.
In character.
Be who you are, be who it's in you to be. Dare to do that. Some of us have done it and it didn't kill us. What would have killed us is not doing it. Learn
Well,
from
that's what I was going to say.
it.
I think it's beyond bravery with you. It's strength. You know, you have the strength to be that person, to be who you are. The bravery comes afterwards when you're comfortable in it and you flip everybody off who isn't comfortable with it. But the strength is what got you there.
Exactly. But I was doing a better job of killing myself than anybody to be who you all wanted me to be, so to speak, as we would say in AA, right? And if someone stabs me in a dark alley, well, then it's over. It doesn't matter anymore, right?
Yeah.
But what I was doing to myself was a slow and horrible death. And I suspect there's a whole lot of people out there who believe their brokenness is not part of what it means to be human. And the truth is, we are meant to be a little broken. My grandmother, I talk about this in my book. My grandmother is Scottish and Muskogee, right? My people are Scots and Muskogee. And she taught me about God by teaching me about the world, right? The natural world, and making pies and all kinds of stuff. And one of the things she taught me was that people are like geodes. You never know what they're made of or how beautiful they truly are until something breaks them open. That's how God gets in, and how the God in us gets out.
The light.
Yes. To paraphrase Leonard Cohen, yes. We're meant to be a little broken, right? So I'm not saying just,
Well, I think that's why we're here. I mean, that's my whole purpose of life thing,
I would
is
agree.
to figure out and heal our brokenness, whether that be inflicted on us in our life, whether we inflict that upon ourselves, through our decisions and all of those things. We are supposed to become better. We are supposed to become more loving. We are supposed to learn things in this lifetime and be there for everyone else to do the same.
And I would add, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I am loving talking with you, because there are not many people I can have the depth of this conversation, like that I can talk about the Greek and the Hebrew with. But anyway, I digress.
Our audience gets it too. They're totally following along, right?
Great. Yes.
Yes.
I would add not only are we to learn from our brokenness how to be better, but maybe our brokenness helps us. I forget who said it now, but it's an old Christian saying, that God comforts us not to make us comfortable, but to teach us how to comfort others, to make us comforters, right? So the same is true for all these other things, right? If I learn how to be a full self with broken parts, then that informs me about your broken parts and someone else's broken parts. And then maybe if you hurt me, I have some point of compassion for that. And that alone immediately changes how I move and live and have my being in the world, right? But then if on top of that, I'm willing to accept that we're all relational by nature because God is relational and we're made in God's image. If God wasn't relational, God wouldn't have created creation, right? So
we're a social beast.
Right. If I'm willing to be in that space and extend to others the same acceptance I want extended to me, then that changes how I live and move and have my being in the world. And then if I'm willing to suspend disbelief that these sacred texts are really about humanity and the search for God and how we should comport ourselves in a universe where God is assumed, then that changes how I live and move and have my being in the world. Because then I'm suddenly going, oh, is the story of Canaan about what I think it's about? Or is it about, hell no, God wouldn't have said go into that town and kill everybody and every living thing. This story's about something else. This story tells us something about human beings think they hear God when what they're really hearing is their own greed or their own power or their own, right?
That's my point. It's a warning. A lot of it's a warning. Do not be like this.
Yes, when don't be that guy.
Yeah, when they said Trump was a king, I'm like, that was a warning. It wasn't something to embody.
Right. And if I'm gonna, so I'm gonna go work once a month at the soup kitchen because that makes me feel good about my 2 BMWs and all my, well, okay, that's fine. But what am I also doing to address the systems that create poverty and food deserts in my own town? Right. Like maybe that's not my thing. Right. But maybe I can contribute in some other way. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a meme going around Facebook right now that says, stop pulling people out that have drowned in the river and go upstream and find out why they're jumping in.
Exactly.
And that's what we need to do. I mean, I think that humanity, as a rule, it tends to be lazy with these types of things because it's not easy.
No.
Before we came on the show, I was telling Liam about how I went to a march. It was a BLM march for someone who had been killed here. And a white couple showed up and they were very aggressive and they were trying to stir shit and get people arrested. So I had to go through the crowd. I was predominantly, if not only, white person there, and put myself in between this aggressive white couple and all of these Black people that I was there supporting. And had I not done that, chaos would have ensued. Victims would have been arrested. These white people who were there just to cause harm and chaos would have walked away fine. But a lot of people would not have done that, would not have gone and said, right, no, jump in here, because they would have been afraid or anything like that. For me, that's why I was there, was to make sure that I was there as being an ally and trying to do this. But it's not easy.
No. And I would, I think I say this in this book, but I certainly say it when I teach, and I'm saying it in the second one. It's becoming a person is work.
Yeah.
And it's not for the faint of heart. Which is why so many people, and to me, those are the things I grieve, right? Because I think so many people slumber through their lives. We can go through life on autopilot. I know I spent 20, 30 years of my life almost completely dissociated. I know we can go through life on autopilot and overfunction and, do really well.
Live as ants.
Completely unplugged, It's easier in some ways, but not on the inside of the inside of the inside. Do you know what I mean? Like in the middle of us, things are not okay when we're slumbering and when we're just going through the motions. And yet Becoming a person is not for the faint of heart. It's work to when we say something, go, wait a minute, is that really what I believe? Right? Or, when we do something, say, oh, darn, how would I have felt if someone had done that to me? Or to start with the self and recognize that a transformed world is made by transformed people, right? Like, we are transformed, like you were saying. We are here to be a little broken so we can learn to be a little better, right? We transform the world because we ourselves have been transformed.
Well, and I think that we can go on as ants, right?
We
And
can.
go through our day and do whatever we want, but there's going to be a lack of fulfillment, a lack of wonder, a lack of beauty.
Yep.
When your head's in the sand the entire time and you're just trying to get that food and build that home, and then you miss out on everything else. So even as hard as it is, I always stress that it's worth it. It's a bitch. It is pain and crying and getting all of those wounds healed. I mean, think about it when you burn yourself or something like that. That wound hurts. When you break your bone, there is forever a mark on your bone that was broken. And for us to think that our emotions are any different, to where we don't need to heal and we don't need to process those things, pour that peroxide on that cut, clean it out, scream like a banshee.
Cry if you gotta cry.
Yeah. I have a bat that I used to take and beat a tree, this really, really thick tree that could take it. And that was my way of getting things out. And I felt better afterwards, but we have to do something in order to grow. I just helped a friend with a book, and I learned that less than 1% of butterflies actually, or 1% of caterpillars actually make it to be a butterfly.
Yeah, it's hard work.
Yeah, I mean, they don't want to go through
that.
Nervous
system hurts.
Yeah, and and they become worried about all this stuff. But we can become those butterflies if we do put that in.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying about what we can be, and I am certainly not in any way, shape, or form judging people who are more comfortable slumbering or work-orienting through life, right? We need people who can do that.
I'm not judging, but I encourage.
Yeah, at the same time, what I know from my own life and the lives of people around me is that we miss a lot.
Yeah.
And that we miss a lot, but what we really miss is learning what we're capable of. Right? Like, if I don't, okay, here's a good example. Every day that I went to school when I was growing up, I got bullied and beaten up for being ugly, right? For having this visual defect, the things people called me, and then for looking like a boy, right? So I got, what is that? What are you? Are you a boy or a girl? All the time. And if I didn't answer the way people wanted me to, in the way that made them feel okay, I got my ass beat, right? So I learned how to take care of myself. But if I had just checked out, just unraveled completely and let them put me in the hospital, or, just stopped functioning,
A lot of people do.
or shot myself or ran out in traffic or something, right? I never would have learned what I learned about myself by getting up every day, putting on clothes and going to school. Right? What I learned was that I could do hard things. I could do things that hurt. And I could find ways to still do something in my day that made me feel good about me. Whether it was that, I made it to art class without getting my ass whooped, and I did something in there, or I got to spend a few minutes with a friend I really liked. I learned how to make friends. I learned that I could do that not very many, sadly, right? But I had one or two. Everywhere I went, everywhere we moved, everywhere I went, I was able to make friends. And that taught me ultimately that I wasn't a piece of shit. Right? Like, so
Right.
so what I'm saying is, it hurts And I'll be the first one to tell you it's worse than ripping out your stitches on your own. It hurts. It's uncomfortable. Sometimes you find out things about yourself you don't like, but doing that work allows you to change it into something about yourself that you do like.
Yeah.
Right. And gives you compassion for other people. Because the truth is, most people who are mean-spirited don't mean to be.
Hurt people hurt.
Yes. I was going to say most people who hurt people because someone hurt them.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that makes it okay for them to hurt other people.
No.
But what I am saying is that it gives us the ability to be more compassionate and then to start looking at how we treat people. Right. So, for example, theological example. Here's an example. This is theological activism.
Okay.
We can read the story of Cain and Abel as purely being about we're not supposed to murder one another. We have the same heavenly Father, right? We can read it that way, and we would be right doing that, right? That message is clear. We're not supposed to murder one another.
Yeah.
We're all family.
Yeah.
But there's a bigger story.
Most definitely.
It is similar to the one that precedes it, where Adam and Eve went a little awry of the plan in the garden, right? There's a similarity here. People went awry of what God's hopes and intentions were. This character God in the story had hopes and intentions for these people, and they didn't live up to them, right? And God marks Cain. Now, most people think that they don't read the story. They accept what they've been told, that the mark of Cain is bad. It's not. It's a mark of protection. And the text,
a lot of people look at it as black skin.
Right. Yes, we've heard that too, haven't we?
Yeah.
The mark of Cain means not white. No, it's literally, the text tells you God marked Cain. No one would touch him and do to him what he had done to his own brother. Now that is an interesting form of guiding, teaching, and correcting consequences versus punishment. So we can then take this story. Yes, we could take this story and look at the holes in it. Like, we don't know why he rose up against Abel. We just know he does. The text doesn't tell us. So what this tells us is about something, right? Our interactions with one another are always about something that's hidden from us.
I've always looked at it as an ego issue because Abel gave out of desire, Cain gave out of obligation. And when God approved of Abel, but not Cain, there was the jealousy, there was the ego, again, you're a piece of shit, so.
That's how we see it. But when you look really deep at the Hebrew, you go, wait a minute, where I'm assuming this means this because it follows that, but that's not necessarily what the Hebrew means. And then if we look at mom and dad, so we look at Adam and Eve, and God literally fashions clothing for them. They make this mistake, and God sews clothing for them, dresses them, and gives them a new place. Right. And then Cain kills his brother, which is way worse than having a combo with a snake and eating some fruit. Yeah. Right? Like the consequences are getting higher. And so do the teaching-oriented protective interventions that God enacts with these humans. And how are we to do any less with one another? So it calls us to totally rethink our penal system, right? Like we can totally use Genesis 2 and 3, or 3 and 4, to look at how we do punishment, right? Should we be doing punishment? Should we be doing something else?
Next week is a CRT, a critical race theory conversation. So that's going to come up there too. But I think, again, we come up with the systemic issues that create our penal system that, it's a path,
Yes.
Our society has created a path to prison for many of the people. And a lot of us just say, well, they shouldn't have screwed up.
Yeah,
but we don't. Yeah,
Yeah.
so many people don't learn until they've walked in those shoes. And I think, like you said, that's part of the reason why we have those stories and why things happen to us where we might not have understood before. I have told a story before, and last week, Chrissy Chavasu said something to me that has been top of mind all week. I told a story about one of the times when I was confused as a trans person and I was assaulted. And she said to me, that warmed my heart. And I was like, it warmed your heart? How could that have warmed your heart? For me personally, it was a tragedy. I was suicidal. I was shamed. I could not even understand how trans people lived with this every day. But to hear Chrissy say that did something for her, took away all the pain, took away all the shame, and gave me that spot to be there for her.
That's
And that
so
is just so
beautiful.
beautiful. And I'm being an emotional mess. I'm sorry, everybody. But that is where we can step in and be that person and say, you know what? I know that pain and I don't want to ever make it to where you have to feel that pain either.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories
Gotta
when
stop
people
crying.
I'm so glad you are. Thank you for sharing that because it's so beautiful. And it reminds me of a similar kind of situation. So I was telling you, I was raised Baptist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that what the church did horrible things to me. But at the same time, there were people who didn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like my softball coach. And anyway, so when I first started doing this work after, shifting from doing crisis stabilization and treatment, right, to theology and starting out that way as a Christian, but letting study of Hebrew lead me to my true roots, right? I was teaching with a lot of my work I do with churches and faith groups of all kinds and teach them like science and theology about gender and sex and sexuality. And often I find I'm also doing some race work too. But anyway, so I was for the first time teaching a group. There was about 60 people there with my pastor, and he and I were doing this thing where he was teaching about what it was like to be in accompaniment with me in this work and to be like pastor to me, right? And us do this work together and what it was like for me as a trans person in the room, right? And so here I am with all these Baptists and I'm freaking the fuck out. I'm like it just freaked me out to even walk in there. And, I could feel all my trauma and I felt like somebody had like dumped gas on me and started rubbing. And yet I had to, push through all that and do it. And so I'm teaching and I get to the point where I'm talking about how we should comport ourselves with one another in a world where the presence of God is assumed. And I was talking about needs, sort of a spiritual perspective on needs. And I said, what trans people and non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, queer folks, need most is grace in sufficient presence and proportion for us to be enabled to freely get out about the business of becoming a person. Right? And he stopped, the pastor was there. And he'd been at rallies where I was speaking and stuff like that before. And I was kind of like, isn't that interesting? He keeps like showing up. Right. But he'd introduced himself like I knew him, but I'd never really had a conversation with him. And he stood up and walked over to the edge of like this, almost like a kitchen bar between this little sort of stage area and where the people were. And he leaned up on it and he was crying. It's this big hulking Baptist dude, weeping. And he says, Liam, thank you for showing me myself because I too need grace and sufficient presence and proportion to be enabled to get about the business of becoming a person. And he turned around and he sat down. And I was like, what the fuck? You know, man, what just happened here? And so two things I learned from that. One is that my sense to just keep getting out of my way and be as relational and transparent and authentic as I can, despite how terrifying that is what matters, which is why I came on this show, really, because you're doing what I believe is the core of how to do theological activism, which is to get in relationship with people and talk about the hard things.
Thank you.
When we do that, inevitably someone says, you know what? I too need that. So the last thing I would say, but I want to make sure I say this, is that what my life has taught me in my ongoing theological growth and faith growth has taught me is that it's not, say it in a positive, what teaches us about our common human lot, what most informs us about what it means to be a human being in relationship with other human beings is not sameness. It is fully authentic, differentiated particularity of personhood. It is diversity shot through everything from, llamas to hawthorn trees and everything in between, right? Like it is diversity that creation hinges on and has affinity for. And if we believe that God is the creator God, then clearly God has affinity for diversity too.
Is it nature loves diversity, society hates it?
Yes, God loves it.
Yeah.
And if we claim to love God, then what we must learn to do is love the particularity of personhood differentiated all around us, because that is the thing that teaches us the most about the very small but huge things we have in common as human beings.
I like to say that if my lizards on the patio can learn to overcome their fear of me, then humans have got to be able to do the same thing, because that's what it all boils down to, right? It's all fear. It's all fear of the unknown. I mean, I have lizards on my backyard that just sit out and just like chill with me now. They're like, okay, she's cool. But if they can if an amphibian can overcome their fear.
Little reptile brain, right?
Exactly. Then with just a little bit of work, we can do the same. It's a desire to do it. A lot of people are comfortable in their fear and they like to feel supreme.
Yeah.
And as a supremacist, whether, regardless of color or anything like that, people have the ego and like to do that. But that gets us nowhere. That gets us nowhere as a society. That gets us nowhere as a human nature, as humankind. I like to say that saying that humanity, we need more humanity is a bar too low. I think we should be more like elephants. They care. Nature cares far more than we do. And, if we embody what was it Jefferson or Edison said, to look to nature is to understand God. And with our emancipation from nature, and by saying that we are better than nature, we took all of that away and took the blessing away. It took all of it.
Yeah. This is what I learned from my grip. You need to read my book, Sherry. You are going to love the third to the last chapter. So, darn it. I had this really profound thing to say, and then I just lost it. So the chapters in the book, in this first book, open with like some kind of scriptural reference. You may have to figure out why I chose that one at the beginning of a chapter, right? Okay. The chapter is not like an exegesis on that, although sometimes it is. And one of the ones is the whole thing. It's Proverbs, I think. That's pretty sad now. I can't remember. Speak to the beasts and they will tell you. Talk with the birds and let them teach you, right? Like we know we will learn more about God if we look at the whole of creation and if we see everything in it and every living being as an embodiment of the image of God imaged here among us, always present. We will learn more about God and more about each other, and we might save our own asses. The way we're going now is going to be the death of us. When we live in opposition to one another, in fear of the persistent particularity of personhood, right? When we live in opposition and outright hostility toward that diversity, we destroy ourselves from the inside.
Oh, yeah.
And that is what we are doing. And maybe that's the reason these sacred texts have been preserved through all these centuries, right? They're all trying to tell us the same thing. When we're beating each other up and killing each other, we're getting something wrong. My last piece of theological activism. We talk about Abraham and Sarai, right? We talk about Abraham and Sarah. What we forget is that God spoke the same promise Abraham got to Hagar, an Egyptian enslaved woman, spoke directly to a woman.
Heaven forbid.
Gave her the same promise Abraham was given, and they gave us Islam.
Yes.
So what God was saying in these two stories, butted up against each other, embedded in each other, is I've called this people to be in this relationship with me. I've called this people to be in this relationship with me. And they both are equal. And therefore we can extrapolate from that. God called some other people over here to be in a different relationship and some other people over there to be, right? Like,
well, and like a parent handles multiple children.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Oh, I like you, Sherry.
I like you too, Leo. And one of the things I want to say, we are at the top of the hour, but one of the things that got me through being a single mother was the verse about, for even God provides for the sparrow.
Yes.
And in the worst times, in my most fears, in my, crumbling of how am I going to provide? How am I going to do these things? I thought of that verse. And I would look at the squirrels, I would look at the sparrows and how they had food every day and how they were comforted and how all of that was provided. And I said, if you were to provide for even the lowest, the least among us, then surely you would provide for me too. And without nature, without that touch of nature, I would never have had that. And that's truly what got me through. There were too many times of just pure terror, being alone, single mother, no one to help, no one to run to. But that verse got me through because those sparrows are fat.
Yeah, they are. They eat.
They eat. Same with my squirrels outside.
Oh, this has been so much fun. We need
I
to do
agree.
this again.
Okay, so let Michelle says she'll never get tired of listening to you. I want to give a shout out to Michelle because she's the one that introduced me to Liam.
I love you, sister.
And then David says we're all similar but different. Yes, we are.
Yes.
I like the analogy of the labs, the dogs, where you have the black lab, the golden retriever, and all of those things. That's all the same dog. They're just all different colors.
Yes. Yes.
And then Kirsten with the 3 hearts. Do we have any questions before we move this to the VIP? She says she loves you too.
I miss you.
I love all this love.
Michelle is the big sister I never had.
She is a dear, dear friend of mine. I love her enormously. And she's a big supporter of the show. So,
yay.
Okay. So, let's get, we have any more questions from anybody? I want you to go buy Liam's book. This is the name of it. Transforming Proclamation, a Transgender Theology of Daring Existence. You can also find it on his website, liammichaelhooper.com. Do you have any closing words for us, Liam? You have been absolutely wonderful.
Oh, it's been wonderful talk with you, Sherry. So one thing you can also do if you enjoy my weird look at things is a buddy of mine and another buddy of mine have a podcast called the Bible Bash Podcast. And
Okay.
so you can look up BibleBashPodcast.com and it'll take you to it. It's a lot of fun. This time,
And you're on Twitter at Bible Bash too.
Yes, I am. And I would just say, look me up, say hello. It's been a lovely thing to be around the fire with you.
Thank you so very much. I'm going to kick you backstage, and I will see you in just a few minutes. Let me make sure. Just have to put up Michelle's. We call me BS for short.
Yes, we do. And now everyone knows.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so very much, Liv. You were wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know I say this every week, but these are so cool. Don't get tired of me saying it. I won't get tired of having these shows. Thank you so much for being a part of it. If you are not a member of the VIP, go over to sherrypalace.com and you can join for, like I said, as little as $3 a month. And it's a huge support to me to keep me going. I want to again thank our sponsors. Next week, it's next Tuesday, same bat time, same bat channel, we will be talking about critical race theory. There is a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of ignorance. So we're going to be educating on it. Come see if you agree, disagree. You can learn something and be a part of the show. I really appreciate everything you guys do. And once again, thank you so much for being a part of us. I'll see you next week. Bye.